All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome, CRPN Central. This is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe. Helps the mission more than you know so that I can do more for you. Welcome to TrialSide Chats. Here we are, everyone. This is, I think, week 7. We started this in the beginning of the year. We're starting to slowly get to some of the interesting parts of clinical research. We're looking at case studies. We had comments. Overall, for a streaming that is just now starting on a Monday, I think we're doing pretty darn well. So welcome everyone to TrialSide Chats. I am going to log into the LinkedIn Live over here so I can see that. I'm going to come over here to comments. So if you are tuning in right now, please feel free, leave a comment. Let me know that you can hear me and tell me a good joke. I'm always a big jokester. My daughter was admittedly very not fond of dad jokes and puns and things like that. I think that I think we need a good joke on this Monday. It's been a really, really weird day. Happy Monday. Happy Monday, everyone. Industry's just going crazy right now. We've got weird vaccine things happening. We've got weird contract provisions coming in through all the new negotiations. I think there's a lot of scrambling going on. There's a lot of really, really worried people out there. I think that one of the most important things to comment for all of the viewers out there, if you are going through a rough time right now, I promise you it will be okay. It will always be okay one way or the other. It's not done immediately, but just hang in there, everyone. Hang in there. So let's go on to here. This is an open forum. Full disclaimer before we even start. I am not a lawyer. I never said I was. This is truly experience. If you are looking for a lawyer, however, Edie Edens, Edie Science Law, edielaw.com. Seriously, give Edie a call. She knows her stuff. She's super duper engaged in the industry, and she's going to take care of you. So by continuing this video, you have agreed to this disclaimer. Listen at your own risk. Take this as experience, and if you really need a lawyer, contact Edie. All right, so ground rules. We're going to talk anything finance, and that's okay. Anything finance, clinical research finance, you're going to be learning some things. We're going to be talking about some things. It's always a very sensitive subject, so at all times, this must be confidential. We do not disclose names. We do not point fingers at organizations. We only talk about concepts. If we think of these concepts like case studies, everyone, we're going to be able to learn from some of the mistakes of the past. We're going to target best practices so that we can make sure that everyone, and I mean everyone, sponsors, sites, CROs, everyone has what they need to succeed. Because if you really think about it, if you really think about it, we're all kind of in this for the same thing. We're just at different angles. We have different lenses. All right. Icebreaker. So we kind of talked about this before, but one thing to note, and I've seen this so many times on negotiations, when I'm negotiating and I have like an admin fee, a laboratory fee, regulatory fee, whatever it might be, and I say, okay, well, these are services provided, but these services provided, they are going to be in our building. They're going to be using our internet. They're going to require all of trash services. We're going to have to communicate with people. We're going to have things like this. It incurs and calculates overhead. That's really, really important because many times what happens is sponsors and CROs will sit there and say, well, no, administrative fees, that is overhead. So we're not going to double dip. We're not going to sit here and say, we're going to give you overhead and then calculate overhead on top of it. It's really, really important to define overhead, my friends. Overhead is not service. So, you keep the lights on, you pay your electric bill, whatever that might be, that is overhead. If you actively negotiate a contract, if you file something with the IRB, if you are doing a contracted service, that is not overhead. And in fact, that requires the calculation of overhead on top of it. Sponsors and CROs, I think it's really, really important to define that and to have that understanding, because the assumption that an administrative fee is part of overhead is frankly wrong. So we need to have a good understanding of that. If you have any stories about overhead calculation, or any kind of the assumptions around overhead, share the story. Let's help each other here. Let's talk about that. All right, so we are going to cover the book. There's the book right there. This is a book that took me about a year to write. I only did about an hour at a time, and I focused really, really highly on what the needs of a research site are. So this is everything that you need from start to finish for a clinical research site administrator to manage their site. It's available on Amazon, or if you want to reach out to CRPN, you're welcome to buy the book. If you reach out to CRPN direct, we'll give you 10% off and free shipping. That's the QR code for Amazon, but if you need CRPN, you'll have to send me a message. All right, so we are going through the triad here. We are talking about the 3 pillars of a clinical research site. At the first one, or last week, we talked about the administrative pillar. Today, we're going to talk about the regulatory pillar. And then finally, next week, we'll be talking about the operations pillar. Maybe next week. Admittedly, I have to travel. So I may end up pre-recording this and then having it still on Monday. Let me know what y'all think. And then maybe if I can tune in, I can actually be there and type answers and responses to you. I can be part of the LinkedIn Live. So if you have any questions for me, I'll be right there. And I don't have to be running the show. All right. So administrative teams will provide you with the infrastructure for the legal infrastructure, facilities. They want to make sure that everyone has what they need to succeed. The regulatory team, the regulatory pillar, that is different. So they don't necessarily do structure, and they don't necessarily see patients or perform clinical trial visits. The regulatory team is focused on quality, 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 compliance, compliance, compliance. That's the key. We are talking about that group. I jokingly call it the principal's office sometimes. It's that group that you always sit there and you make sure that at all times you are performing your clinical research according to the rules, that you are documenting according to the rules. This is all about quality and compliance. As a result, the regulatory team will oftentimes be the ones responsible for like the regulatory submissions to third parties such as IRB. They're going to be the ones that are going to engage with a compliance level to represent the site, to make sure that the site is doing everything that it's supposed to do according to local and federal law. And as a result, that local law, that is really, really important, because local law at a clinical research site is actually, well, not only the law that you'd have within your city that's local, but within your organization, your quote local law is your SOP manual and the document control around that SOP manual. So the regulatory team is kind of like your blueprint. They're going to sit there and have the plans. They're going to make sure that everything is planned and appropriate and that you follow those plans. That is the essence in regulatory, which also means that as staff members come through, they're going to oversee training. Sometimes they'll have to do a training matrix, whether it's study specific, because let's face it, every single study is going to have training. And even on the other level, so archiving. So after the site is closed, after you have documentations, after you have to archive for literally decades, because it is according to 21 CFR and because you have to follow compliance for archiving, the archiving also falls within the regulatory team. So huge, big responsibilities for regulatory. Now, the out of scope things. So what is regulatory not doing? Well, they're not doing patient visits. So they're not actually taking the protocol and looking at the visit and scheduling it and performing the visit. And they're not even filling out the source. That is, in fact, the performance of the trial. Now, they can go back on a QA level, quality assurance, and they're going to sit there and say, okay, well, you performed all this research. We're going to take a look at the source. We're going to perform QA. Sometimes sites will have like an internal site monitoring, site audit kind of a thing to make sure that you have quality at all times. Sometimes, depending on the site, the QA department can also do like data entry or data review before they release the data into the third-party external systems. And other times, they may just oversee or do spot audits or audit readiness or things like that to make sure that at all times the site is doing exactly what it should be doing according to the rules. So these are you've got to follow the rules, people. Sometimes not the favorite people in the world, but that also reminds me. So, as far as a regulatory team goes, well, what kind of a character, like what do you have to really adhere to love regulatory, to love the rules, to love to follow, um, to fill out paperwork in just the right way according to what the IRB and what regulations are telling you to. Um, so the regulatory team is also not responsible for the infrastructure itself. So they're not going to procure leases, they're not going to pay rent, they're not going to do that. They're going to do a specialized regulatory service according to contract. That also means that they're not going to do contract negotiations. So they're not necessarily the ones who are going there talking about the money, talking about the law, talking about the legal. They are definitely in the regulatory realm as far as the performance of a clinical trial and as far as the operations or the procedures or adherence to the procedures within a clinical research site. And also on like a business development side, you don't necessarily see regulatory people doing business development. However, what I should note is that there's always some kind of a crosstalk between these different pillars and the relationships that you have as a result of your regulatory team. Like, let's say that you've had a stellar audit and the CRA is super duper happy. It's really important for the regulatory team to sit there and be like, hey, we really enjoyed working with you. We'd love to hear about more trials. Why don't you go talk to our business development people? Go talk to our administration people if you ever want to work with us again. So that crosstalk is there. I'm not saying the regulatory team doesn't help to contribute to these things. I'm saying that's not their superpower. That's not their specialty. That's not really what they are at the site to do. However, they can help to emphasize it or to enhance it so that everyone can help everyone else. I should also note that is the important reason why every single one of the people in these pillars, and notice I call them pillars, they are not siloed. Pillars are not silos. It's really important that the pillar that you are in, you have an understanding of what you own and what you are responsible for. But that doesn't mean that the other things are not your responsibility. That just means that you know who to send things to in the event you run into something. Um, I would say these pillars have bridges in between them. And there's constant communication between these pillars so that everyone knows what everyone else needs to succeed. Everyone is going to know, you take a look at one thing and you say, oh, you know what? That's not really in my pillar, but I know exactly who to send you to. So you send them over that way. Nobody in clinical trials, nobody at site is closed off at all. So here is the pillar. This is on page 38, and this is part of the graphic. You saw part of the graphic last week, and you'll see the operations side next week. But on the regulatory side, the regulatory team, it's led by the PI, because guess who signs the 1572? It's the PI. And we knew that part. But then as far as the PI goes and all the SOPs and the following and the filings and things like that, the regulatory team, they're going to do the IRB filings. So you're going to do their 1572. You're going to notify the IRB in the event of something really bad, like let's say an SAE happens. You're going to be working really, really closely with the operations team to figure out the SAE. And then guess what? You're also going to be working with your legal team to say, okay, we know what regulations say, but what does the contract say of like how long do we have to submit things to the IRB? How long do we have to notify the sponsor? That's in the contract, everyone. So your regulatory team is going to have to talk to your contract team to figure out what are the rules around the really important IRB filings, especially like SAEs. They're going to be responsible for regulatory documents. Now, we know 1572, we know that initial submission. They're going to be the ones collecting the CVs, making sure the PI signs the CVs. They're going to be the ones making sure that there's licenses and scanning of licenses. They're going to be the ones that make sure that everyone is trained properly, not only on like the industry wide, like GCP, IATA, anything that you might be responsible for, but also for anything else, like on a site level, anything like that. They're going to make sure that team members are trained, that they're following compliance, that everything is done according to the rules. Finally, as we said before, they're going to file things with the IRB. They're going to take the source, put it in regulatory binders. They call them regulatory binders for a reason, whether it's electronic through the ISFs or whether it's in a paper form. And the regulatory team is going to oversee and protect those documents because it is what you have to do for compliance. On the, not necessarily the trial side, but going into the internal side, the regulatory team is going to have all of the document control systems in place for the SOPs. They're going to make sure that SOPs are signed. They're going to make sure that SOPs are adhered to. I should note these are the SOPs that are research related. Depending on how your organization is structured, it's very possible that you could have entire departments with their own SOP manual. Like, for example, HR. HR is going to have an SOP manual that the regulatory team in the research may not see because that's how HR does their job. The regulatory team is going to oversee specifically that research-related SOP manual, dissemination of it. They're going to approve things. They're going to route for doc control to make sure if things need to be changed. They're going to be the ones to own the archive of that. They may have to be delegated by the administration or given recommendations by operations on what to change on the SOPs, but they're going to be the ones to hold that document control system. And because they are the ones to hold that document control system, they are also responsible for the compliance of that document control. On the employees, on the third parties, many times SOPs will require adherence to privacy law, things like that, with third parties like CRAs and sponsors to make sure that the site is at all times compliant and therefore audit ready. Now, to do that with the administration team, they're going to coordinate things like the submissions of the regulatory documents, especially in times where there's a dispute or an escalation where sponsors are non-compliant financially, and they may have to be careful how they submit certain things, especially during a site activation, where I can guarantee you regulatory teams are going to sit there and say, hurry up and file this with the IRB, hurry up and file this with the IRB. And then the admin team saying, we haven't even gotten the contract and budget yet from the CRO, so we can't really send anything. We can't release anything to external parties. We have to make sure we at least have a contract in place before we bring anyone else involved. Same thing with monitoring visits. The regulatory team is going to have a procedure in place with audits to make sure that audits are paid for, to make sure that everything is according to contract, to make sure that how the regulatory team and how the site responds to something as big as even an FDA audit. Hopefully there's an SOP in your manual sites that tells you how you're going to address an FDA audit, or even a site audit, or even how that is paid for. And then finally, there's closeout. So the regulatory team is probably going to be one of the first groups, especially since the patients are no longer on a trial most of the time. They're going to be the ones who are notified of closeout. Hey, we need to close out your trial. It's up to the regulatory team to sit there and say, hey, administration team, how are we doing on our finances? Are they okay on their invoices? Are we okay to close out the trial? And then after the trial, after closeout, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have to contact your admin team and notify look at CFR to see how long you have to store those documents. Is there something in the contract that says you have a certain amount of years that you have to store those documents? Does it just say federal law, according to federal law? So you have to look at the federal law. It's 2 years after decision. You're going to have to sit there and you're going to have to track clinicaltrials.gov to figure out when a decision was made. And then you're going to have to figure out document control systems to where when are we, how long is our obligation to store these documents? And then after your obligation is over, you're going to have to talk to the administration team to understand what processes you have to do in order to destroy the records. Can you just sit there and destroy them? Do you have to notify the sponsor first? Do you have to give the sponsor a certain amount of time? So you're going to have to work from a regulatory team to an admin team in order to fully, from start to finish, from award all the way to finishing closeout and even document destruction, that conversation between regulatory and admin team is critical. I'm receiving phone messages. I'm just making sure that I have everything okay. But finally, 33%, and I mean 33% of a trial's revenue is a direct result of invoices. And at least half of that 33% of the site's revenue is regulatory invoicing if a trial is negotiated properly. So regulatory teams need to at all times have a really, really direct conversation with the admin team. And I mean, we're saying, hey, we had green light. Well, here's the green light date. Hey, we've got a protocol amendment. Here's a protocol amendment date. Does this change the budget any? Is this out of scope? Do we have a monitoring visit? Here's a monitoring visit. Here's the dates. Let me know about that. IND safety reports, trainings. We're talking about many, many, many invoiceable items and contracts that so many sites miss out on. And it's because of that direct communication line between the regulatory team and the administration team. So invoices are critical between those two pillars. So let's move over from the regulatory team, like the compliance team, and we're going to go into the operations team. So while the regulatory team has all these things in place to help the admin work and the admin does what they need for the regulatory team, there's a totally different line of communications that can happen from compliance and regulatory over to the performance of the trial. And this is where we're talking regulatory team is going to oversee compliance as far as the performance, Alcoa, Alcoa C+, all the different ways that the personnel need to document source, need to do. That's all compliance, but that's on the oversight of regulatory over to operations. Operations, they do the work. Regulatory helps operations perform the work in a compliant way. Documentations, there's queries and query resolution. That's going to be a QA problem. That's over in regulatory, over to the documentation of the actual source, what has been performed. So regulatory oversees, operation records, and both of them talk with each other to make sure that they are compliant at all times. AEs and SAEs, I cannot stress this enough. Of course, when you are taking care of a patient and there's an SAE, the operations team is going to be involved because they're going to be the ones who are seeing the patient, making sure the patient is okay, contacting the hospitals, working with the communities, whatever it might be, depending on how extensive the SAE is. That operations team, they're going to be doing it right there with the patient. The regulatory team is going to be there to back them up. Hey, how are things going? What are we doing? Is this a hospital thing? Let us know. We need to get this over to the IRB. We need to notify the sponsor. We need to, whatever it is, you've got a component for the operations team to help the patients. And then you've got a component for the regulatory team to help support those operations folks during that very, very stressful time. I don't know if anyone's listening. I see two people on. Do you know how long you should be taking to report an SAE to the IRB? Anyone? Let's see if anyone's listening. There's a test out there. See if you can do. But I can tell you, it's very, very rapid. It's super duper fast. Audits. So the coordinators are the ones who do the work. The PI is the one who oversees it, and they are going to be the ones to answer some of the questions and to literally make the queries, make the document changes to the source, because they're the ones who are making the recordings. So regulatory team can help them with audits, audit readiness. There's going to be QA. So you're going to have QA. Sometimes sites will do internal audits so that they can make sure that by the time a monitor, CRA, or sponsor sees something, it has already been reviewed and audited internally by the site for optimal quality. And finally, agency correspondence. If you get into agency correspondence world, regulatory teams and site teams, unless you are a very well and established site, and I do mean like you have very good and experienced people, this is where it might be really good to bring in some of the pros. If you are engaging directly with agencies such as the FDA or groups like that, this is where I would, don't risk that. This is where you need to talk to ED seriously if you're in that situation. But the point is, regulatory team has the quality control and oversight. and they assist the operations team with proper documentation, compliance, and performance of the trial. All right, so that's the end of the lessons learned. Thank you so much for everyone for listening in, for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message. We try to have this once a week so we can see what's going on. And now let's move on to case studies. So these are real stories that have happened with sites. They sent me messages. We make sure that everything is anonymous. Sites are not called out. We only look at the concepts and the case studies, and we try to look at these case studies in a way with all of our different lenses so we can help each other navigate it a better way. So here is one of the quotes from our sites, and it said, "We invoiced for IRB continuing review submission. Good job. Hopefully it was on time. But the CRO told us that, oh, no, they are doing the IRB submissions." And this happens a lot, honestly, everyone. This happens a lot with some of the CROs. And then they said, "Why was this in the contract if the CRO is doing the work?" That's a really, really, really good point. So I can tell you, have you ever run into this, first and foremost? Most of the time, honestly, this comes from the low budget CRO world. And I don't know. It's the CROs that are not very common. They kind of like, or the sponsors who are trying to save money. Most of the time, that's the only time I see this. But you're going to see the CRO that says, "Oh, no, we file with the IRB. And so therefore you as a site, you don't get paid for the services that you performed internally to prepare for that IRB submission." That's pretty much how it goes. And it's a lot of back and forth. And sometimes a site, depending on who they're working with, they can sit there and say, "Wait a minute, you as a CRO, you do not represent us as independent contractors. You might push the paper around. You may be like, send us this report, then we'll send it on behalf of the sponsor. We'll send it maybe in a package, sometimes with multiple sites, whatever it is." But I think it's really, really important for anyone who has a CRO tell them this to maybe mention to the CRO that, one, it was in the contract. It must have been negotiated in a way that an operations person didn't agree to, but it was in the contract. Sites are entitled to, and they should be compensated for all of the work that they do in an IRB continuing review. It takes a lot, CROs. It does take a lot. You have to sit there in a submission. Oftentimes, you have to go talk to people. You have to get signatures. You have to process it. And importantly, you have to represent your site. CROs, you do not represent the sites that work with you. Notice I said with, not for, with. So as a result, if it's in the contract and if the site did perform efforts to put together a submission, even if they did send it to the CRO to eventually send to the IRB, the site should be paid for. So to answer your question, my friends, why was this in the contract if the CRO is doing the work? It's in the contract because the CRO is not doing your work. You are still performing efforts on behalf of your organization, the site, to prepare that continuing review. And that is what the contract should be paying. You should also note, sites, one thing that I learned here is you can do this during your PSSV, or you can do this during like pre-feasibility or when you're talking about things. This is a question that many sites will ask because they run into this. Do you, the CRO, plan on submitting to the IRB, or is this a responsibility of the site? Get that up front, because I can guarantee you when the site personnel are negotiating this contract, they are under the standard industry assumption that as an independent contractor, the site will be submitting to the IRB. Why can't the CRO, oh boy, this is my fault. I typed this and I did it wrong. Why can't the CRO, or I remember what this was. Why can't we get the CRO to pay for our advertising? It's in the contract. How can we access these resources? Oof, okay. Advertising is baked into contracts depending on the negotiator. Most of the time, it's one of the most stringent invoice items to have. Most of the time, it's highly regulated. So you're going to have IRB approval. You're going to have the sponsor approve the costs before you spend it. You're going to have to, when you invoice, submit that sponsor's approval and the justification of the actual costs in the invoice that you send to the CRO. A lot of prepositions there, my friend. And so as a result, this thing has a ton of red tape, and I mean a ton. Most of the time in this situation, you've got like a business development team or coordinators who have no idea what the contract was saying, or they don't understand the process, and they just think that the sponsor's a blank check. So they're going to sit there and say, oh, well, we just spent like tens of thousands of dollars on advertising, and it can rack up a lot depending on the indication that you have. But guess what that means? It means you kind of just spend a blank check and expect the sponsor to pay for it. What do you think is going to happen? So sponsors have to put regulations around this. If, and a big if, the value is like an up to value, like up to so many thousands of dollars in your contract, if that value is in your negotiation, you need to read the fine print around that to see if you have to have sponsor approval. I can guarantee you it's going to require IRB approval. There's a lot of provisions you're going to have to check off before, and I do mean before you request these funds or even spend these funds from a sponsor's contract. Otherwise, this happens all the time. Sites, you're going to eat the advertising costs because you didn't follow the rules. So how can we access these resources? Well, importantly, read the contract. And even if it's not in the contract, if it's something that you feel is really, really needed in the trial, reach out to your CRA, have the conversation. So what's going to happen is you're going to reach out to your CRA. They're going to forward you to some kind of a budget specialist, finance person, and they're going to either say yes or no. And they're going to say, how much will this cost? Give us documentation. We have to think about this, yes or no. And ops teams, I think what happens is you get impatient because you want patients on, the sponsor wants patients on, and you don't want extra hoops. So you get frustrated with the advertising and you either eat the cost and hope for the enrollments, or you take your time and then you get reimbursed, unfortunately, in that order. I saw one, I do mean one little likey thumb up. So I know someone was out there talking. It's a pretty quiet day over here in TrialSide chats. That's okay. We're still going to finish our recordings on a strong note. It's still up here. It hasn't changed, everyone, because I'm still waiting for your comments. But hopefully, as we go through this process of going through each of the pillars and explaining what happens in each of the pillars, this can grow a little bit more. What is missing from this negotiation as far as invoices go? This is a cardiovascular heart failure study. It does have survivor follow-ups of up to 3 years. The screen fail percentage is 65 and the enrollment goal is 7. This was presented to the site with 3 invoice line items. There's a study startup for $3,000, and notice that is at the site activation. I wonder, what is the difference between that? When else could that be payable? There's a study closeout for $1,000, and that's at closeout. And then finally, there's document archiving for $500 at closeout. This is a practice budget, but I can tell you that components of this did come from actual negotiations throughout the industry. This is, my friends, what sites see on a daily basis for these trials. This is offered to them for the services that they perform. And if I sound passionate about that, that's because, spoiler alert, this doesn't pay the bills, but this is what they're offered. This is what sites have to deal with. So I'm curious, if you watch this, if you get this far, what would you do differently on this budget? How would you negotiate this? I'm still waiting. And, we're going to have a conversation about this in Chicago, Illinois at the Manasa Summit. So if you have any interest in how to negotiate invoiceable items at a level that is responsible for the actual performance of the trials performed, meet me in Chicago. Let's talk about that. You should check out the Manasa Summit, and we'll go from there. So on that note, I believe that we have finished the content for the day. I think that we've gone through some really good things. Um, let's put this up here. So here's the website, the QR codes for the YouTube channel. Please feel free to subscribe. I'll never, ever compete with the cute kittens and the video game players of the world, but my objective is a little bit different here. So I really appreciate it if you'd be willing to support the mission, subscribe, and we're gonna every single week put one of these out. So you're gonna have really cool content to talk about. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I hope to be like Edie someday. Edie capped out her connections, so now she can't even get any new ones. I'm not there yet, but I'd love to see it. And then check out the website. So CRPN is huge. There's a lot of really cool things about it. You have, for example, sites, sponsors, and CROs can join. Sites can join for free trial opportunities and some of the best financial management services in the industry. And then sponsors, you have hardwired into CRPN an entire network of accountable, high quality clinical research sites across all indications. And we have officially pretty much eliminated the waste of startup. So you walk in, you have a CRPN site, you have assurance that that CRPN site does a really, really good job. You award them the trial and you submit the 1572 that day. No negotiation required. Just remember that. It's really, really cool, and I'm excited for it. So as we progress through TrialSide chats, I'm looking for any guests, anyone who wants to come, as long as they can follow the ground rules. Love to have these conversations with them. Otherwise, if there's no other comments, as I don't see any, no worries at all. This is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe, share your voice.